Abigail Richards. I'm one of the C+V graduate fellows. If you're new to our webinars, this is part of the Community and Values Initiative, which aims to continue to empower and bring our community together by increasing our sense of belonging and connection to each other through exploration and co-creation of our collective. Especially despite hardship right now, we created these weekly webinars to continue our efforts in supporting our community through it all. With all that's going on in our city, state, nation, and world, we know how difficult it can be for all of our community members. Our last webinar, we spoke about resiliency and coping, and we thought it would be great to maintain that focus as we lean on our community to get through this together and lift one another up and support each other. Joining us today, we have some faculty from the Graduate School of Professional Psychology. I've worked with Shelley in the past, and we've done a webinar. I don't know if we've done 2 webinars together or one. Yeah, 2 webinars together. Joining us is Dr. Shelly Smith-Acuña, Dr. Katy Barrs, and Dr. Mark Aoyagi. Sorry if I mispronounced that. And I would read your bios, but they're all great and they're online. But I would like for you all to.
I will. Thanks. Yes, I'm Shelly Smith-Acuña. I'm the Dean here at the Graduate School of Professional Psychology, and I am really honored to be part of this work. I think the discussion of community and values was already important before COVID hit, but right now, suddenly, I heard this analogy of like COVID has given us an MRI of kind of what is going on with the system, and we can see both well, we can see what's not working, but that lets us see opportunities for change. And so I really welcome this discussion to think about again how we lift each other up and what we can do differently. For me, what I see, and when I check around, you know, the networks that I am in, a lot of what we talked about in the early webinars and so forth, just some of the basics of self-care and part of what psychology has to offer just in reminding people to kind of stay grounded in those basics of self-care, whether it's, you know, exercise and nutrition and sleep and being out in nature. I know that, you know, you guys had asked, you know, what about introducing ourselves, but talking about our own coping, that's been really important for me. But for this discussion, what I really want to open up and I'm super curious about is that unique role that the university can play in helping us take care of each other and really get through this time in the best way. And I am giving that a whole lot of thought right now. So I look forward to that discussion.
Thank you. And whoever would like to go next.
Hi, my name is Katy Barrs. I'm a psychologist at the Graduate School of Professional Psychology. I have had the distinct pleasure of working with veterans and service members and their families throughout my career. I work in the military psychology specialty at GSPP, and I'm also the clinic director of the Sturm Center, which is our off-campus behavioral health clinic for veteran service members and their families. For me, working with veterans and service members is full of resiliency every single day. I mean, that's what I see. That's what I witness every day. It can be painful at times to hear the stories of what people have gone through, but the most amazing part of it is to watch people continue on, demonstrate resiliency in difficult times. And so I feel like I'm constantly applying what I learn working with the military into my day-to-day life. And so I'll be excited to talk about resiliency today too, especially here on campus.
I'm Mark Aoyagi. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this. Community and values are 2 things that the students that I work with here maybe ad nauseum, because they're things that I really like to talk about. And so it's really an honor to be part of this. In terms of my bio, I already have to correct. I'm sure I need to update my materials because on the opening slide, it listed me as the Director of Sport and Performance Psychology program. And I'm very pleased to be the co-director of the Sport and Performance Psychology program with Dr. Jamie Shapiro. So the sport and performance psychology, if people aren't familiar, is a little bit maybe different than what comes to the front of mind with psychology, where a lot of times people, and I won't suggest that this is true, but I think a lot of times people's belief is that psychology is really about helping people move from some state of disrepair, dysfunction to sort of a normal state. And sport and performance psychology works from more kind of that functioning state to the other end of the spectrum towards sort of optimal performance and peak experiences. So, and that's, sports psychology is kind of the field term, but we actually talk about it in terms of performance psychology because our program, our faculty, and our belief is that those same skills and abilities that are taught to athletes in a sports psychology sense apply to all performers and all people. And so that's where we bring in the performance psychology side of things. So that's hopefully the perspective that I'll be able to share a little bit today.
Thank you all. And I forgot to mention that throughout the conversation, if you have any questions, you can just use the chat option or the question and answer feature, and we'll get to that at the end of the conversation. Before I get started, I really do like to ask and help ground ourselves and really ask, how are you truly doing? How are you doing as a person, as a whole human, and how are you coping through this time?
You know, for me, it's been up and down. I think the past 4 or 5 months have felt, you don't even know the time anymore. It's like, was it 4 months? Is it 5 months? Is it 3? I don't know. But it's been kind of a roller coaster. It's up and down. Some days coping much more effectively, other days really tired. But the wonderful thing is that I feel like with the support of the people in my life, whether that's at Graduate School of Professional Psychology, at DU, or in my personal life, that's been one of the key things that has helped me to get through this time. I also have a 13-month-old, and does that take a lot of energy. So I know that it's super important for me right now as somebody who's also a caregiver in the community, at least in terms of giving back to veterans and service members, training students, and also raising a child. It's really important for me to be taking care of myself. As a psychologist, you know, sometimes we don't always practice what we preach, but we certainly try. Some days I'm better at it than others. But definitely working towards resiliency during this time, because I think it's hard for individuals. I think it's hard for the system. I think it's hard for our DU community. It's obviously hard for our national community right now. So yeah, working on it. It's a work in progress.
Thank you for sharing. Shelley?
Well, I alluded a little bit to the self-care piece, and I would agree with Katie. You know, it's ups and downs, and some days are better than others, and I go from feeling discouraged and really tired and kind of overwhelmed to then feeling strangely energized by the challenge and kind of feeling like, gosh, you know, problems that I've been thinking about for years now need to be solved in a matter of weeks instead. And that there's something kind of exciting about that too. And I'm glad I don't have little kids at home. So that feels funny to admit that, because I'm happy for all the people that do, but I think that some of my challenges are easier in a way to not have to pull all that in too.
I appreciate Katie and Shelley bringing in the larger context of our lives. I introduced myself in the first part of the question as sort of my work and professional identity. But actually my core identity, the most important part for me of my identity, is about being a parent and a partner. And so I've got a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old. And, you know, there was some disruption when you know, COVID hit, and then the school that my 7-year-old was attending went online. And so, you know, there was some stress around that. Any change, there's always stress. But by and large, and I should also mention my wife is a nurse. And so, you know, she was kind of on the front lines of seeing the pandemic happening there. And so there was kind of this interesting juxtaposition of she's seeing kind of the brunt end of the pandemic, while we're sort of sheltered in our home going, what's the big deal? And so we had that, it wasn't a tension, just really juxtaposition is kind of the best way that I can say that. But I would say for that first pandemic, the the COVID pandemic, it was largely a positive for us. I mean, there were stressors around, you know, what was going to happen with school and how was learning going to happen, and, you know, my daughter missed her friends and those types of things. But we got to spend a ton of time together as a family. You know, the kids in our neighborhood were all home from school as well, and we just sort of agreed that our block was going to be one big family. And so there was a lot of really great things about that. And then when the George Floyd murder happened, and the social justice pandemic became more, at least for me, at the forefront of my attention, that one really shifted the world under my feet. And I say that recognizing the position of privilege that I have, that it took that to experience that shift. And I think part of it was that I'm a very optimistic person, and I'll talk about optimism and resilience as part of this webinar, but I try and practice what I preach. And I saw the first part of the COVID pandemic as, you know, so much reinforcement for this optimistic framework of, although, you know, many people that were not at high risk themselves were taking these proactive measures to help the vulnerable in our communities. And like I said, community is a huge thing for me. And so, man, it was wonderful to see that happening. And then in the midst of that, the George Floyd murder video coming out, and it was just literally a gut punch. I mean, that's not even a great analogy to use here because it was far worse than that. But it was just this ground shift under the feet of like, how can this happen ever? How can it happen now? You know, when my sense was there was this, we're all in this together kind of a feeling. And again, saying that out loud, you know, smacks me in the face with the privilege that I've had all along to have some, you know, sort of tacit awareness that these things were happening, but not to be experiencing it. And, you know, I still can't claim to be experiencing it, but I'm trying to consistently and keep it in my awareness and be more aware about that. And so to ultimately get to the question of how I'm doing, I do try and practice what I preach, and I do feel that I have a fair amount of resilience and a fair amount of ability to grow from experiences such as this. And so I've really dived into educating myself on social justice issues, on the Black community, on the experience of being Black in America, on the history of being Black in America. And for that, I feel good, you know, that I've learned and grown and beyond that, and implementing actions to hopefully do at least some little part in making things better. But that being said, it's a heavy weight. And again, it's hard to say these words because, you know, I recognize that for me, it's a change in my experience. And from that experience, it's a heavy weight. There's been a far greater weight that many more members of our community have been carrying for their entire lives. So, you know, I'm very aware of my white fragility in that this incident for me was, you know, sort of a trial and a tribulation, whereas for many people it was sort of business as usual. And so I'll actually flush that out a little bit more in some of the answers to the questions later on in the webinar, but I'll stop there for now.
Thank you all for sharing.
Abigail, how are you?
I thought it was interesting. Everyone's talking about practicing what we preach, and C+V has tried to have a lot of these conversations on self-care and resiliency and coping. And I think it's a good reminder because I definitely forget, and then I have to organize a webinar, and I'm like, oh, well, this is a reminder that you need to take care of yourself, and you need to go on a walk and create boundaries and figure out what you need. I do like being at home, but I've realized recently that I've isolated myself a little. In the last couple months, I was doing really well at the beginning, reaching out to community, but with everything that's been going on, I've kind of self-isolated in a way of just wanting to deal with things alone and realizing it's not working. So the last week has been reaching out to people again and trying to recreate that cadence of just FaceTiming and communicating with folks and going on social distance walks, which has been really helpful. But thank you for asking. So the second question is, given your work, how would you define resiliency and what does that look like to you?
Well, I can talk a little bit. I actually looked up my favorite definition of resiliency, which the Army actually came up with in 2015. So the definition is it's the ability to adapt or bounce back following adversity and challenge. And the idea of resiliency connotes inner strength, competence, optimism, flexibility, and ability to cope effectively. So for me, the key thing in that is the flexibility piece, that we have to have different types of coping. It's not all I take a walk too. That's one of my primary coping skills, but you have to have different tools in your toolbox. And so to have a variety of types of coping skills, I think is really important. So I think about, for me, I need different coping skills for my spiritual piece of myself, for my physical piece of myself, for my mental and my emotional piece of myself. So I think about that a lot, having a variety of ways to kind of soothe myself, my body, my mind, my heart, all of those things. I also really like that in the military, they talk a lot about grit. So grit is this idea that we can persevere if we have passion about something. So I can't help, I mean, for me, this is like the key thing behind Black Lives Matter. So a group of Black people have gone through so much oppression over the years, and now that's one of the biggest social movements of all time. And so to me, that is the exact definition of grit. One of the things that the military and performance psychologists talk a lot about is, in order to have resiliency and grit, though, you also need a safe, stable environment. So you need to be in a system that is safe and stable, maybe not nurturing, that might be too extreme, but safe, whether that's emotionally, physically, psychologically safe. And so that's where I think it's really important that as a university and a community at DU, we're stepping up and we're thinking, how can we make our individual students, faculty, staff more resilient right now? How can we help them reach down and ground themselves with their grit? But we have to be doing that as a community too. So I think individually we're in charge of managing ourselves and coping, but also as a community, we need to be doing that together. Not in a top-down way, but as a community, no matter what level you're at, that we're making sure that it's an inclusive place. We're supporting each other in this resiliency.
Yeah, if I can build off of that, the performance psychology piece of this, I want to emphasize that talking from the performance psychology perspective, I'm going to be joining with what I anticipate Katy and Shelley will be saying. So I don't mean to, pit this as our perspectives are against one another at all. I think they're very much in parallel. Just the language that I'll use will be a little bit different. And the neat thing here with what Katy just said is that actually the US Army is the largest hirer of performance psychology graduates. And so a lot of what Katy was talking about, the skills are taught by sports psychology graduates. So the other thing I want to make clear is that sport and other performance domains are not war. As much as, we use war analogies and things like that in sport especially, the physical risks are not the same. There's not a risk to your physical well-being. Well, I mean, there may be like in terms of an injury, but not in terms of death, right? Mostly. But the mental and emotional risks are similar in the sense that your identity can be on the line. So anyways, I say that as a bit of a preface to say that hopefully my language will be respectfully appropriate of the difference between the physical risks that our servicemen and women are taking versus more of the mental and emotional risks that athletes and performers are taking, and certainly mental and emotional risks that servicemen and women are taking as well. So all that being said, the definition for resilience in kind of the performance psychology literature is using personal qualities to withstand pressure. And I kind of like the simplicity of that definition. It also separates that into two qualities of resilience. And so I think the original Latin meaning of resilience means to bounce back or something like that. And so you have this idea of resilience when there's some sort of shock or, insult or damage done, that you're able to rebound quickly. And that's sort of termed rebound resilience, the ability to absorb that and sort of bounce back or return to a state of normal or well-being. But there's also this quality of robust resilience, which is the ability to not get knocked off your center when something happens. So sort of to not need to rebound. And that more proactive, robust resilience is something that I really try and emphasize. And it has to be front loaded, right? It's not a skill that you can build after an insult or an injury or a challenge happens. It needs to be front loaded and developed ahead of time. So those are kind of two distinctions I like. And then a third frame that I'll bring into this is the anti-fragile frame, which is moving from, if you think of something that's fragile, a shock or some sort of insult is going to break that or destroy it in some way. And then sort of at the midpoint, you have this idea of resilience or robustness, where there is some ability to withstand some shock, kind of that robust resilience, and possibly also some ability to rebound from that shock or insult. But then at the far end, you have this anti-fragile framework, which is a word that I'm blanking on his name right now, Nassim Taleb created as sort of the opposite of fragile, which there didn't exist a word for that. And the idea with anti-fragile is that the individual or the system actually benefits from shocks, from disruptions, from unexpected events. And as you can probably guess, humans are anti-fragile. We need shock, we need stress, we need pressure, we need all these things to thrive and to grow. And so I really like that framework as well, to understand that, in sort of our common lexicon, we think of stress usually in a negative light. While also most of us recognize implicitly that we need stress to grow. Again, for athletes, an easy analogy here is weight training, where you're actually breaking down the muscle in order for it to come back stronger. And I think that analogy holds across many aspects of the human experience.
See, I told you I was looking forward to hearing from my colleagues. I don't have a lot to add other than I really do want to get back to even my MRI example. I think part of what's surfacing is ways that we need to grow and change. Like resilience is not just I can stand in place and withstand this, but with what my colleagues have said, thinking about opportunities to learn about our own strength, but also for me, the idea of how the university can be resilient in really growing and changing as we face what isn't working here is really important. And so I know, we're talking more about, I like the anti-fragile because many of us are reading how to be an anti-racist, but thinking about what would it be like to be a culture that was anti-racist and anti-sexist? And can we, if we're having to look right in the face at the way that our culture is at DU is racist and sexist right now, because it's surfaced in new ways, then our opportunity in being resilient is not just to withstand looking at that, but thinking of it in a more transformative way.
Thank you all. And this wasn't, I just came up with this question, but something that's come up is that it's seems like resiliency is very specific to the person. Yeah, there are other contextual factors like your environment. How do you center resiliency personally for yourself? I think in keeping up with how do we practice, what do we preach, how do you center resiliency in your life?
Well, for me, I think that resiliency is really guided by personal values. So the things that are going to help me feel resilient and help me cope more effectively are going to depend on what's important to me. So I have to think about that on multiple domains, though, like I was saying earlier, the physical piece, the emotional piece, the spiritual piece. And I think that part of it really has to come from within for it to be effective. But for me, it's community, it's the support of others in my life, it's my family. And then it's also things like music or getting outside, things like that. But I would say primarily it's feeling a sense of community and connection to others. that will keep me motivated to try to take care of myself during times like this. So for me, it's very values-based.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. So personally, you know, in psychology for a long time, we've talked about a mind-body connection. And I think what we understand now is it's beyond that. It's an integrated mind-body system. And so, you know, I try and maintain a regular practice of addressing each of those components. So I'm pretty, I'm not regimented about much, but I'm probably pretty regimented about sleep, nutrition, hydration. I have a daily mindfulness practice, exercise. So, you know, just sort of making sure that I'm addressing my well-being. And a lot of that, as Katie said, when you move into more of the mental and emotional realm, has to do with being purpose-driven and having self-awareness about who I am and who I want to be. So, yeah, I think being pretty rigid around those things allows me to be pretty flexible in, I think, a lot of other areas of my life.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that's been said. I think part of what I would add about well, for me, definitely what I'd add is just recognizing the social component, which you alluded to earlier, Abigail. And for me, I just know that's a lot of what feeds my soul is relationships, and recognizing the challenge that my default way of nurturing relationships can't work right now. So I have to be intentional about how I'm going to keep all of that on track. But the purpose-driven piece for me, again, I alluded to kind of facing what hasn't worked at the university, which is part of what's in the chat, and seeing the opportunity to in some ways feel energized by the challenge, and that making me feel more resilient, and kind of looking at the parallels at the university. You know, what kinds of things, like what kinds of safe spaces can we set up just to begin to start the process of change, and recognizing, being intentional about that. Even that isn't easy to figure out, you know, what constitutes a safe space and how you create it. But that's okay that these things are challenging. I mean, I think that, speaking of values, I mean, that's right to acknowledge the challenges there.
Thank you. Thank you all for sharing. We're going to shift a little bit. We've had a lot of conversations in the last week, a lot of webinars and town halls on fall and what the fall is going to look like. There's a lot of anxiety and a lot of stress associated with that. I'm not going to be there this fall, so I'm not part of that conversation. But as we begin to reimagine our upcoming fall quarter, what is going to be very different from previous quarters, how do we begin to have these conversations that focus on building and supporting student, faculty, staff, and parents really on resiliency? So like, how do we prepare for the fall quarter?
For me, there's multiple things that are really important for us to be doing as a community, for leadership to be doing, for students, faculty, and staff. But I think one of the major things right now is transparency. Like, as a community, we need to understand what's going on within the university, what's happening, what decisions are going to be made, those kinds of things. I think not knowing what's going on in a time when things feel so chaotic makes it even more difficult. I also think decreasing stigma for people asking for help. Like, it's okay to ask for help. I'm a psychologist. I don't always know what to do. I might know on paper what to do, but it doesn't mean that I always do it exactly right. So I think sending the message that it's okay for people at all levels of our system to need support right now and to ask for help. I think we got a long way to go in DU in terms of building an inclusive environment. And we really need to be at a place where people of all groups and identities feel more comfortable on our campus. And that's going to be part of getting through the COVID piece too, is that we're doing that as a team. that we're acknowledging difficulties within our system. We're acknowledging not everybody on campus feels safe. In fact, many don't. And by safe, I can mean emotional, physical, different things. But that we're working together as a unit. And that feels very pie in the sky in a way when I say that. However, I think that's what we need to be working towards right now, is building a sense of community, because that's going to help us as a community and as individuals to be more resilient.
Well, I'd like to, thanks, Katie. That was really neat to hear that. And to build off of that, I wanted to amplify something Shelley has said a few times, which is about the challenge ahead. And there's a concept that I usually incorporate with teams, individuals that I work with, which is this idea of challenge versus threat. And if I can just give a brief definition of those, a threat would be when a perceived demand exceeds our perceived resources. Whereas a challenge is when our perceived resources exceed the perceived situational demands. And so you hear me emphasizing in that this is all a perception. And it comes down to the question of, do I have within me what I need? And that's where the training that I try and implement with people is to answer that question of, the question that I hope that they can ultimately earn the right to answer with is, everything I need is within me. And that's not to say that you have the answer to every problem or solution or a problem or challenge that could come up, but it's to say that you believe that you have the ability to cope, adapt, adjust, compensate, whatever needs to happen given the unfolding, unpredictable unknown, which is the present moment. And so I just wanted to flush that concept out a little bit, because I think it's a really useful frame to recognize, am I approaching this situation, whatever the situation is, as a challenge or a threat? And ultimately that means, how am I answering this question of, do I have within me what I need to meet the situational demand? But then I also want to shift gears and say, it's not all on the individual either, right? There's an environment and there's a system and there's a context in which this all plays out. And so maybe I'll save some of this for other questions down the line. But just to talk a little bit about the environmental piece, if it's all right, I'm going to share a little bit of, actually, I don't think I said in the very beginning introduction who or what I work with, but I primarily work with professional teams and athletes, and had a coach of a professional team text me a few days ago and say, hey, we're getting ready for this most unusual of seasons. And I'm emphasizing that word for a reason. What advice do you have? And I'm just going to paraphrase a few things I sent to him, if that's all right. And so this is talking about athletes, because this was in a sport context, but we can easily substitute students, faculty, staff, parents here, humans here. So I said, athletes are great at adapting. People are great at adapting. It's one of the things that's allowed humans to thrive and, do the accomplishments that we've achieved. And then I said, but they take their cues from their leaders and their coaches, from faculty, from staff, from parents. And so therefore, as coaches, you can set the tone by not assuming it's going to be hard. And then in parentheses, at least not any harder than what is usual or normal, which is that there's always change, there's always stress, there's always challenges. And so the truth is, there are always going to be unexpected things that come up, and this year will be no different. And so part of that is to say that, yes, we need to acknowledge that there's going to be stress, but I don't think we need to be leading people down the road of, and that's a bad thing, right? That, coping implies that something negative is going to happen. It could be a great opportunity for many people. Now, that's not to say, again, that there's not going to be the need for additional support resources as well. But I think the framing of the question becomes an important part of how you respond to the question. I'll skip that part to keep it brief. But the thing that I wrapped up with is that the most important point is that all we have are moments. I made reference earlier in this text to, there are quote unquote big moments in the game or in the season, and there's difficult moments and this and that. But the reality is all there are moments, and that label we put on them of big or bad or ugly or challenging or threatening, they matter. And if we can strip it back to removing those labels and just saying, this moment right here in front of me, I can handle that, right? If we look at it just as this moment, we can answer that question of everything I have is within me, because we know that we can face this moment. Where we get stuck is when we start to think about, oh, but this happened in the past, or oh, this might happen in the future. And that's when we start to bring in some of those labels. But I think that ability to come back to the present moment, that skill, I should say, of being able to come back to the present moment and experiencing it just as it. And the corollary to that is us being just as we are, not trying to do something different. The more that I think we can stay in that framework and experience that state, the more we're able to consistently answer that question of everything I have is within me.
Thank you for that, Mark. That was really interesting. And I have to say, it's so interesting to think about how resiliency is so individual, really, because for me, I would need to say, we have the ability. Like, it would be less about I, it would be more about we. And that's okay. I think that's the values piece of it. I cannot help but think about a term we use a lot in the trauma literature called, it's post-traumatic growth. I often get asked by people, why do you do this work? Why would you choose to hear about rape, sexual assault? Why would you choose to hear about combat? Why would you choose to hear about all these trials and tribulations that humanity goes through? And my answer seems kind of trite, but is really true and really powerful for me. It's the post-traumatic growth that I get to see on the other side of that. So this time in history is painful, and I feel hopeful that our society can grow from this, that we can become more connected, that people can understand their privilege, that people can be less racist, that we can be more of a true, genuine community. So as painful as it is right now, my hope is that the post-traumatic growth piece of it will pan out and will be much better in the long run. But that's what I have to tell myself and ground myself in, is that this pain will mean something productive in the future. And mean something productive right this second, right now.
These comments are also great, and I did want to share my answer about fall, which is going to sound very pedestrian compared to my colleagues, but I did want to take the opportunity to say that we really do have the opportunity to work together and listen to each other and create something that actually is going to be effective. And in particular, I think for me, recognizing in human nature the temptation to overreact or underreact, and to not be engaged enough, or to, kind of inflame the fears. And, if we really take that middle ground and recognize that there will be challenges and that we have so many resources to meet them. And at the university, we have so many resources to meet these challenges, and we don't know how to use them yet. So when I said what sounds pedestrian, figuring out how to get the technology and everybody in IT to work with us as faculty members and to work with OTL on what kind of pedagogy is actually going to work over the next year, that's very nuts and bolts, not super inspiring to think about, except that's what's in front of us and what we really can do together if we, again, ask the right question, not how is this going to fall apart, but what can we build that's really going to meet student needs. And when we stay focused on that, what can we do to meet student needs? I feel very good about being at DU, because I think that's where the question gets redirected to almost always, and that I feel very supported in that mission.
Thank you all. And just a reminder, if you have any questions, you can use the question and answer feature or the chat option. So my last question is, what do you believe the role of community resiliency in helping one another cope through this tough time? So what is the role of community as we enter the fall quarter? What is that going to look like, and how does that play a part?
I mean, it's, for me, totally 100% essential that we're working towards community as a unit. And that's not only departmental, it's not only discipline specific. It's not undergrad versus graduate, it's really DU as a whole. So for me, the idea that we're a community right now is, I mean, to me, there's like nothing more important. That's what we really have to be focused on.
I appreciate Katie again queuing me up here. I love the we have within us what we need, and that was, I completely agree with that, and that I was alluding to was saving for kind of this community resiliency question. So you know, I've been emphasizing or talking a lot about individual resiliency, but there is also in the performance psychology literature the idea of team resiliency, and again we could substitute community here for team. And this sets the environmental context. Team resiliency, community resiliency sets the environmental context in which people experience individual resiliency. So there's an intimate relationship between the two. I'll share a study real quickly, just to nerd out for a minute, where, and this was done on a college campus, Virginia, I believe, where they took students individually, loaded them up with a heavy backpack, and then had them walk up a steep hill. And then they did the same thing under some guys. I don't remember what the story was. They had a pier. So two people put on the heavy backpacks, walk the incline together. And in the pier condition, when there was multiple people involved, the perception of the steepness of the slope was less. And so, and that relationship between literally viewing the challenge as less threatening was mediated by the closeness and duration of the relationship between the two people. And so just as Katie and Shelley have emphasized, the quality of relationships is critical to community resiliency. It's the critical component that's come out, again, from the performance psychology literature of team resiliency, the quality of relationships in the team. But I'm sure that the same would be true of the quality of relationships in the community is going to be the critical factor in community resiliency. And then the other, sort of the next most important factor after relationships is that resilient teams, resilient communities have a strong value of learning. And that value of learning then translates into this this knowledge, this front loading of, yeah, we can adapt to whatever, again, to go back to this idea of the unpredictable, unfolding unknown, you can't prepare for that. So all you can do is embrace a learning value, or a growth mindset would be the common term for that, to know that whatever the situation presents or demands of you, that if you don't at that particular moment have within the community what you need to overcome it, that you can learn and figure it out and adapt to what's needed. And then if I can also just say quickly, well, maybe it won't be too quickly, but importantly, that, you know, the question was asked about the fall, and, you know, Shelley and Katie have done a wonderful job of addressing that. I want to address this idea of resiliency long-term a little bit more, which is, using the example of, you know, it's well known, I think well known, that Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in the sport of baseball. And Branch Rickey was the general manager of the team that allowed, would be the best term to use, Jackie Robinson to break the barrier. We know that it wasn't a question of being skilled enough. It was a question of being allowed to step on the playing field. And Branch Rickey did that with very good intentions of recognizing that he wanted a Black player to be part of Major League Baseball. What I don't think that he recognized, but what is completely obvious in hindsight is that you're completely limiting yourself if you're, cutting out any segment of the population from being part of your workforce. And, so now we know that, I'll mess up the exact stats, but I believe the National Basketball Association, the NBA, is 85% African Americans or people of color. And I believe the NFL is somewhere around like 70-75%. And so, if you're a GM now in this current moment, you would be insane, right? To say, oh, well, I'm not going to let Black people or African American people play on my team, because you would recognize that you would be at such a performance disadvantage. And what I shared with my students in the spring, and what I'll share here now, is that's that same scenario of literally leaders disadvantaging their organizations by not allowing certain segments of the population equal opportunities to be in that, whatever it is. That's happening in still basically every other labor market other than perhaps those professional sports. And so specific to DU, it's for sure happening in higher education. 85% of college and university leaders, whether that's presidents or provosts or whatever, are white. 60 some odd percent are men. I think if you look at the chief financial officer position, it's 80 something percent are men. 85% of the top tier of faculty are men. So there's no question. And, if we go into people of color in different underrepresented groups, they're far more underrepresented than they are in the general population in higher education. And of course, we know this is true in businesses and corporations and other domains across the world, really. So I would say long-term, if we want to have a more resilient community, let's have a better community by ensuring that we're hiring more faculty of color, that we're recruiting more students of color, that we're hiring more staff of color, that, and so we'll get kind of that Jackie Robinson effect of marginalized community members by definition have to be more resilient. So the resilience will come baked in. But what we'll also benefit from are all of the skills and abilities and innovation and everything else that will come with opening the doorways to people of all backgrounds. And, that will be the true accelerator of, probably not even needing this idea of resilience anymore, because we'll be in a thriving community that is really able to optimize and maximize itself, rather than one that's, got itself tethered to the notion or the idea that that we're sort of optimized as is, and using things like these artificial standards to say, oh well, this or that person didn't get in because their GRE score wasn't this or that, or their SAT score wasn't this or that, or their GPA wasn't this or that, and not recognizing that that's disadvantaging all marginalized populations, because they're not competing on a level playing field for their time and attention, let alone the resources that are given to them or provided for them. Don't allow them to thrive in the same way as the dominant white community. So, and I'm saying dominant in terms of white supremacy, not in terms of they have some sort of innate dominance. So anyways, I'll end my soapbox there, but that would be my hope for the future of our community.
Shelley, do you have anything to add? I know, and just going off your comment, I know my biggest fear, not being a student anymore, but my biggest fear for the DU community is understanding, as a Black student, it's been really hard. Something that I've loved about this initiative is really focusing on that not everyone feels a part of this community. Some of us had to go find and create our own communities to survive being at DU, not forgetting that that's not gone given COVID, that's just going to be exacerbated, where, we have social issues going on, as well as the impact of COVID disproportionately affecting people of color, predominantly Black people, and then also an election year, and not realizing that some of us don't know if we have the resources for DU to feel like a safe space for us to even feel like we can become resilient within ourselves, but even as part of the community. So just hoping that the institution and the leaders are remembering that some of the problems of the past haven't gone away. Sorry, Shelley, I'll let you answer the last question.
No, Abigail, I just really need to highlight what you just said, because courage, and it's not just courage. I know it's perseverance. This is not the first time you've had to say something like this. And the idea of, together sticking with this is really inspiring to me. And I think not only seeing the opportunity, but you can't see the opportunity without, again, really looking at what doesn't work, and to have the courage to look at what doesn't work. And I already said it, I don't know the answer. I think what's crucial, not just to the fall, but some of the long-term outcomes that Mark is talking about, is to create safe spaces, and not safe spaces where people have to just go underground to talk about what doesn't work because there's no place they're being listened to, but to change the culture where we really are listening. So I hope, I think that's going to be key to true, not just survival, but actual resilience that's transformative.
Yeah, and I would say that those of us with more privilege have to step up and really be an active participant in that change. It can't remain the people that are marginalized. It has to be all of us doing that together.
Thank you. So I think we have time for one question. So one of the questions is, many of the suggestions that have been made may be much more difficult for those of us who already suffer with depression and anxiety, as we're already compromised. Do you have any suggestions or ideas for how people affected by mental health issues?
Well, I once read a stat, and please don't quote me on this because I didn't look it up before, but that it's like 90% of people meet criteria for a mental health disorder at some point in their life. So I actually think that I hate the word normal as a psychologist, I really do, but it's more common to have depression and anxiety than we realize. I think many more people have experienced depression, anxiety, loneliness, substance use during this particular time in history. And that's not, I don't say that like everybody is experiencing it to minimize it, because that's not the point either. Yeah, I guess I'm just pointing it out that for me, we can take that and use that for resiliency too. Honestly, I think the university making sure that they're providing effective accommodations that protect students during this time too, whether it's physical issues, mental health, depression, anxiety, whatever it is. But it's really important that students know their rights in terms of applying for reasonable accommodations, and that the system respects and protects those students that need more resources at this time, or faculty or staff that need those resources at this time.
Yeah, that's what I would want to echo. And I know that what I'm gonna say is really easier said than done, but great that you acknowledge that you're having more depression and anxiety and not fighting with yourself about it. But instead, if you can use that just to ask for more resources, and whatever, whether that's accommodation, whether that's availing yourself of the therapy services that DU has, hopefully finding some place, someone to ask at the university, how can I get more resources? Because now is the time to do that.
Well, and I'll add that, I think a lot of, and I'm trying to be very sensitive here to recognizing that anxiety and depression are very challenging situations to handle. I mean, that's basically the definition of them. And one of the parallels between that and the dual pandemics that we're experiencing is it can cause us to turn internal. And there is an internal part of that that's very useful, right? Like I talked about, making sure that you're taking care of yourself, sleeping, eating, exercising, having a mindfulness or whatever mental practice and emotional practice that you have to be grounding. And one that I would suggest along those lines is a practice of gratitude. and being a explorer for instances of, and you can substitute any other emotion that you'd like to experience more of there, but gratitude has a lot of really well-researched downstream effects on well-being. And so that's one I like to choose. But, you know, you can insert awe or curiosity or excitement or, you know, whatever in that sentence. But be an explorer for that. And then note at the end of the day, 3 instances, or again, that's a random number, but it's one that's been supported by research. 3 instances of excitement or awe or gratitude or whatever that you witness throughout the day. And it just helps to broaden your lens and sort of get you out of your own experience and into the experience of the world. And again, it's the same, you know, if we talk about resilience writ large, it's kind of that same thing of appreciating the larger context. If we talk about either or both of the pandemics that are happening, they're oftentimes a result of a narrowing rather than a broadening of our experience. And so that practice just sort of helps to broaden that perspective a little bit.
Well, I want to personally thank you all for being here and sharing your expertise and your personal experiences. We're done with time. We don't have enough time for another question, but we won't be having a webinar next week, but we'll be having our next webinar in August, the first week of August on Thursday, and more information will be available on our website. Thank you all for joining and being here. Please feel free to email us if you'd like to join our listserv, or if you would just like more information on how to be involved. Thank you all for coming.